P.O. Joseph signs with the St. Louis Blues for, I believe it was 1 year, $950K. Obviously, the move in the back end of that is the Penguins bringing in Sebastian Aho, 2 years, $775K. But with P.O. Joseph's departure is the end of the Phil Kessel branch of one of the longest tenured trade trees in NHL history, running from 2001 until 2024 and potential to go beyond 2024. It is now down to, as we'll pull up the trade tree here for everybody watching on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, it is now down to Erik Karlsson, a 2026 third round pick, and minor leaguer Dylan Hamaliuk, who is right now unsigned. So he could be gone in the matter of a couple of months, and it could be down to a 2026 third round pick and just Erik Karlsson. We'll bring up the trade tree here, and it all dates back to 2001 when Jeff Norton, of all people, was traded for Bobby Dulles. That branch didn't last long. And Johan Hedberg. That then went to Alex Goligoski in a Vancouver second round pick. That went to, then, of course, Matt Niskanen and James Neal, which went to Patrick Hornqvist and Nick Spalling, which then created the bulk majority of this tree because Nick Spalling, of course, included in the Phil Kessel trade. Hornqvist traded for Mike Matheson and Colton Sevier. Kessel then traded for Galchenyuk and Joseph. Galchenyuk turns into Jason Zucker, which clips off at that point. Matheson turns into Ryan Poehling and Jeff Petrie in a trade that all of us are still having nightmares about. But then Jeff Petrie kept this thing alive when he was part of the Erik Karlsson trade last August for Dylan Hamaliuk, who is still technically under control by the Pittsburgh Penguins. Erik Karlsson, a 2026 San Jose third round pick, and Rem Pitlick was part of that as well, but Pitlick was traded for a conditional seventh, and the conditions were not met, so his branch is cut off as well. Crazy trade tree, starting back in 2001, including, I would say, at least 2 Hall of Famers, right? Phil Kessel, potentially. Erik Karlsson is there, potentially. And a couple of very important pieces for a couple Stanley Cup runs from the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Yeah, it's no doubt looking at some of the names on here. I mean, it's some of the biggest names in recent memory, too, for Penguins fans. I mean, you mentioned, like there's Hall of Famers like Phil Kessel and Erik Karlsson, but Jason Zucker ended up being a really fun player for a couple years. Patrick Hornqvist ended up becoming a huge piece of Stanley Cup runs, like you mentioned. If you really get into it, James Neal was fun to have around for a couple seasons. Even Matt Niskanen, whenever he popped off in his last season here, a ton of fun. And the run that Johan Hedberg went on in his rookie season was one of those memorable ones. It's just looking at some of the names on here. They're big names. They're popular names. They are hockey names too. I mean, maybe Alex Galchenyuk didn't work in Pittsburgh, and a lot of the recent stuff hasn't been great. That's a former top, I forget what pick he was, but a former early first round pick that found his way into this. Jeff Petrie is an NHL veteran of many games, and for what it's worth, P.O. Joseph at one point was the Penguins' top defensive prospect. So the names on, there's no small names on this list. Nick Spalling's kind of got a history in hockey. When you get into the minute details of things, is whenever you start really seeing the little names that are here. But for the most part, these are mostly some pretty big, prominent names, not only for the Penguins, but just in hockey in general.
I mean, the one name you didn't mention there, Alex Goligoski was a great NHLer for a very long time, right?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, so that's another one.
There's a lot of names on here. It's a very interesting trade tree that I'm happy continues. I thought it came to an end. I completely forgot about Matheson turning into Petrie, turning into Karlsson, but here we stand with Karlsson and a third round pick. I'm not sure that Penguins are going to retain Hamaliuk this offseason. The question that I have here before we wrap this one up, and also before this gets completely outdated and somebody gets traded, what is the craziest part of this trade tree in your eyes?
Oh, it's tough. It's tough. As I kind of look at it, I'd say the craziest part might be, I mean, not all the details are into it, but just the Erik Karlsson trade itself. Yes, Jeff Petrie is involved, but I mean, Casey DeSmith was involved in it too, and he's not going to be in this, but it was a huge trade that brought so much to the Penguins this past season. That had so much leave the Penguins this past season because it was Kyle Dubas coming in, because there's the whole story behind it. It's Kyle Dubas coming in. He's got a mess on his hands, and has and wanted Erik Karlsson in Toronto. And now he's got a team that has the assets to make it happen, and it's a team that Karlsson wants to go to. And what does he do? He somehow ships out all of the bad contracts, most of the bad contracts, for a player that going into his second year should be way better. Other than that, the Phil Kessel one's obvious. And I'd say it sticks on to the Erik Karlsson deal itself.
Yeah, it's not officially a part of this trade tree because the branch was clipped, but you know who was involved in that Phil Kessel trade initially was Kasperi Kapanen. Then the Penguins brought him back and had him back on the roster as well. So that's a weird little addition to this as well. I think the funniest and most interesting part of this trade tree is the guy it all starts with. If I said Jeff Norton to most hockey fans, you mentioned a lot of these names are names that just average hockey fans are going to know, or average Penguins fans are going to know. Nobody knows really Jeff Norton unless you're one of the older generation and a big fan of hockey, or you've studied the plaque outside of PPG Paints Arena, because he is one of the 2 New York Islanders defenders on the Mario Lemieux statue outside PPG Paints Arena. The fact that that guy is heading up this extensive and crazy trade tree is what I think is the most interesting part of this. And the craziest part of this as well is obviously Jeff Norton and Rich Pilon, whatever you want to say. But Mario Lemieux splitting down between those two. And then now we look at Norton as part of this part of Penguins history as well.
I forgot about that part, the statue. If maybe you do know Jeff Norton because he was a journeyman in the NHL between the late 80s into very early 2000s, 15 years in the NHL, 799 career games, so close to 800. Am I getting the points right? I am. 384 total points in his career. He's a playmaker, 52 total goals. That helps whenever you play defense, and I'm not checking that part out. But 15 years in the NHL, over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 teams. 3 games in Boston, only 32 in Pittsburgh, and yet here he is starting this for the Penguins. Just an insane start for it. He doesn't have a picture on Hockey Reference, so how much more do you need?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, the Penguins traded Jeff Norton for Erik Karlsson.
Over the years and a couple of cups in the way,
over 20 years later, but still, hey, it's what you do. It's that old, if I have a paperclip and can get to a house by just exchanging one thing for one thing, that's essentially what the Penguins did. And they won a couple of Stanley Cups on the way with some of these players being key contributors. You mentioned, Patrick Hornqvist, obviously, Phil Kessel, obviously, and they're hoping, Erik Karlsson, even though they've just entered a rebuild. But I thought it was fun to look back on that because one of the big branches was cut off. Obviously, we thought the Phil Kessel branch would have led to another 20 years, but instead, the return for Phil Kessel was Alex Galchenyuk. That didn't work quickly, and he was gone. And P.O. Joseph, who now walks for absolutely nothing in free agency to the St. Louis Blues. Obviously, it might be a while before we revisit this trade tree, hopefully. I mean, Erik Karlsson has, I believe, 3 years remaining on his current deal. And obviously, the Penguins need to do something with that 2026 third-round pick, whether that is make the selection and see where that player's career goes, or if they use it as part of a trade, who comes back in return. So it'll be a nice little sidebar to keep an eye on, a nice little fun, entertaining off-season piece to keep an eye on. But I thought it was interesting, and we should bring it back up because we had a couple conversations over text throughout the week whenever P.O. Joseph's potential to leave started to spring up on Sunday.